March 14, 1969. 11:47 p.m., Frank Lucas walked into Umberto's Clam house in Little Italy with $2 million reasons to be killed before midnight. 3 Genovese capos sat at the back table: Sal Gigante, Tony Marchetti, Carmine the Snake DeLuca. Between them, they controlled every ounce of heroin that moved through New York City. And Frank Lucas, a black man from North Carolina, had just stolen 40% of their market in 8 months. The sit-down wasn't a negotiation. It was supposed to be an execution. But Frank Lucas had already calculated every outcome. And he knew something the Italians didn't. By the time he left that restaurant, the rules of the American drug trade would be rewritten forever. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand what Harlem looked like in 1969. Bumpy Johnson was dead. 8 months in the ground, the man who had held Harlem together for 3 decades, who had negotiated the peace between black dealers and the Italian families, was gone. And every vulture in New York was circling. The Italians saw opportunity. For 50 years, they had controlled the heroin pipeline, French Connection, Sicilian refineries. Their product moved through every city in America, and every dealer paid tribute. 30%, sometimes 40%. That was the tax for doing business. You didn't like it, you died. Simple mathematics. But Bumpy's death created a vacuum, and vacuums attract men with vision. Frank Lucas had spent 7 years driving Bumpy Johnson around Harlem, watching, learning, taking notes that nobody knew he was taking. He saw how Bumpy handled the Italians, the respect, the tribute payments, the careful diplomacy that kept Harlem peaceful but permanently subordinate. And Frank saw the flaw in the entire system. The Italians weren't suppliers. They were middlemen, parasites taking a cut for nothing but geography and history. Frank had already made his move. January 1968, the Golden Triangle. He'd walked into the jungle with $400,000 cash and walked out with a direct connection to the purest heroin on earth. No Italians, no French Connection, no middlemen. His product was twice as pure at half the price. He called it Blue Magic, and in 8 months, it had swept through Harlem like a blue tide, washing away everything the Italians had built. The word spread through the streets first, then through the shooting galleries, then through the emergency rooms where junkies overdosed because they weren't ready for product this pure. Blue Magic. Everyone wanted it, and only Frank Lucas had it. The Italians noticed. Of course they noticed. Their street dealers were losing customers. Their distributors were asking questions. Their accountants were seeing numbers that didn't add up. Someone was flooding the market with product that didn't come through their channels. Someone was breaking the oldest rule in the American drug trade. The message came through Sal Gigante's people. A sit-down, Umberto's Friday night. Frank Lucas was expected. The word expected carried weight. It meant attendance wasn't optional. It meant refusal was a death sentence. It meant the Italians were done asking questions and ready to deliver answers. Frank's brothers told him not to go. Huey pulled him aside in the Teaneck kitchen. "They're going to kill you, Frank. You walk in that restaurant, you don't walk out." Frank listened. He always listened to family. Then he shook his head. "They're not going to kill me," he said. "They're going to try to tax me. And I'm going to tell them no. And then we're going to see who blinks." Huey didn't understand. Nobody understood. That was the difference between Frank Lucas and every other dealer in New York. He thought 3 moves ahead. He calculated outcomes, while other men calculated odds. The night of March 14th, Frank dressed carefully. No flash, no jewelry, a simple dark suit, white shirt, no tie. He looked like an accountant. That was intentional. The loudest one in the room is the weakest one in the room. Frank Lucas would be the quietest man at Umberto's. He drove himself. No entourage, no bodyguards. Another calculation: showing up with soldiers meant you expected war. Showing up alone meant you expected business. And Frank Lucas was always about business. The drive from Teaneck to Little Italy took 43 minutes. Frank used every one of them, running scenarios, calculating responses, preparing for the conversation that would determine whether he lived or died, whether his empire grew or crumbled, whether the old rules held or new ones were written. He parked 3 blocks away, walked the rest. Let the neighborhood see him coming. A black man in Little Italy at midnight. Every eye on the street tracked him. Every window held a watcher. Frank didn't hurry, didn't slow down, just walked, steady, confident, like he owned the block. Because in his mind, he already did. Umberto's was half empty. That was by design. The Italians had cleared the restaurant. Only soldiers remained. Frank counted 8 men at various tables, all watching him, all armed. He felt the weight of their stares like physical pressure, ignored it, kept walking toward the back table where 3 men waited. Sal Gigante was the oldest, 62, silver hair, dead eyes. He'd killed his first man at 16 and had lost count somewhere around 40. Tony Marchetti was the muscle. 45 hands like slabs of meat. He'd strangled men with those hands. Enjoyed it? Carmine DeLuca was the talker. 50, slim, expensive suit. They called him the Snake because he smiled while he poisoned you. Frank approached the table. Didn't wait for an invitation. Pulled out a chair, sat down. The 3 Italians exchanged glances. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. A black dealer, summoned to a sit-down, was supposed to show deference, fear, respect for the natural order. Frank Lucas showed nothing but patience. Carmine spoke first, that smile spreading across his face like oil on water. Mr. Lucas, thank you for accepting our invitation. We've heard impressive things about your operation. Frank nodded, said nothing. Let the silence stretch. Carmine's smile flickered. He wasn't used to silence. Men summoned to sit-downs filled silences with nervous words, explanations, justifications. Please, Frank just sat, watching. You've built something remarkable in Harlem, truly remarkable. But there are certain traditions in our business, protocols, ways of doing things that have kept the peace for 50 years. Frank's voice was quiet when he finally spoke, barely above a whisper. I know about your traditions. Carmine leaned forward. Then you understand that what you've been doing, it disrupts the natural order. It disrespects agreements that have stood since before you were born. Frank tilted his head slightly. What exactly have I been doing? Tony Marchetti slammed his fist on the table. Glasses jumped. You know what you've been doing? You're flooding the streets with product that didn't come through us. You're taking money out of our pockets. Your Sal Gigante raised a hand. Just a small gesture. Tony stopped mid-sentence, swallowed his rage, sat back. This was why Sal was at the table. He understood that volume was weakness. That anger was a tactical disadvantage. He studied Frank with those dead eyes. Taking measure, Frank met his gaze. Held it. 2 predators recognizing each other. Finally, Sal spoke. Voice like gravel. You went to the source. You cut us out. You're selling product that should have come through our channels. Should have paid tribute. The question isn't what you've been doing. The question is what happens now. Here it was. The moment Frank had calculated 1,000 times. The pivot point. Everything he'd built, everything he'd planned, came down to the next 60 seconds. He could apologize. Offer tribute. Pay the tax. Keep the peace. That's what every other dealer had done for 50 years. That's what Bumpy had done. That's what the Italians expected. They'd probably let him live. Take their 30%, let him keep operating. A black man in his place, making money for white men. The natural order preserved. Frank looked at Sal Gigante, looked at Carmine DeLuca, looked at Tony Marchetti with his strangler's hands. And he made the decision that would change everything. I don't pay no tax to nobody. The words hung in the air like gun smoke. Tony Marchetti's face went red. Carmine's smile vanished. Even Sal Gigante blinked. In 50 years, nobody had said those words at a sit-down and lived. It wasn't just defiance. It was revolution. Frank continued. Same quiet voice. Same steady gaze. Your product is garbage. 30% pure if your customers are lucky. You cut it with baby laxative. Sell it to junkies who don't know better. I'm selling blue magic. 98% pure. Half the price. Better product at a better price. That's not disrespect. That's just good business. Carmine found his voice. Good business? You're stealing from us. Every dollar you make is a dollar out of our pockets. Frank shook his head slowly. I'm not stealing anything. I'm competing. There's a difference. Your customers come to me because I have something better. That's the free market. If you don't like it, make better product. Sal Gigante leaned forward. You think this is a game? You think because you've got a pipeline, you're untouchable. We've crushed men bigger than you, smarter than you. We've been running this business since your grandfather was picking cotton. The words were meant to sting, to remind Frank of his place, of history, of power structures that seemed permanent as stone. Frank's expression didn't change. My grandfather did pick cotton, and his grandfather was property, bought and sold by men who thought the natural order was permanent too. But here's the thing about the natural order. He paused. Let them lean in. It changes. Tony started to rise. Sal stopped him again. The old man was reading something in Frank's face, calculating. This wasn't a man bluffing. This wasn't bravado or ignorance or suicidal courage. This was something else, something the Italians hadn't seen before. You have protection, Sal said. Not a question. Frank allowed himself a small smile. First emotion he'd shown all night. I have relationships. Your people aren't the only ones who know people. Your people aren't the only ones who can make problems disappear. I've been building my network for 8 months. While you were counting your tribute money, I was making friends. Police friends, federal friends, political friends. Friends who like my money as much as they ever liked yours. Carmine's face went pale. You're bluffing. Frank reached into his jacket pocket. Slowly let them see his hand. Let them wonder if he was reaching for a weapon. He pulled out a small notebook, placed it on the table. This is a list. Every cop in Harlem on my payroll. Every detective, every sergeant, every captain, 2 city councilmen, a status, 3 federal agents. You want to start a war with me? You're not just fighting a country boy from North Carolina. You're fighting the system, and the system is expensive to fight. The table went silent. Frank watched the calculations happening behind their eyes. This wasn't how sit-downs worked. The power was supposed to flow one direction. From them to everyone else, tribute, respect, fear, the holy trinity of their business model. But Frank had built something they hadn't anticipated. He'd used their own playbook against them, bought the same protection they'd bought for decades, created the same insulation, made himself equally untouchable. Only he'd done it in 8 months, while they'd spent 50 years. Sal Gigante understood first. He was the oldest, the smartest, the most pragmatic. He saw what Frank Lucas represented. Not just competition, evolution. The future walking into their restaurant and refusing to kneel. What do you want? Sal asked. The question itself was a surrender. You don't ask what someone wants if you're planning to kill them. Frank closed the notebook, put it back in his pocket. I want to be left alone. I run Harlem. You run everything else. Our territories don't overlap. Our customers don't overlap. There's no reason for conflict, Carmine sputtered. No reason? You've taken 40% of our... I've taken 40% of Harlem, Frank corrected. Harlem was never yours. It was Bumpy's. Bumpy paid you tribute because he chose peace, because it was easier, because he was tired. I'm not tired. I'm just getting started, and I don't need your permission to run my own neighborhood. Tony's hands were shaking. Whether from rage or fear, Frank couldn't tell. Didn't matter. You're a dead man, Tony growled. Maybe tomorrow, maybe next week, but you're dead. Frank turned to him. Let the silence stretch again, then spoke with absolute certainty. If I die, every name in that notebook goes to the newspapers. Every cop, every politician, every federal agent, including the ones who work for you. I've got copies with 6 different lawyers. Instructions to release everything if anything happens to me or my family. You kill me, you kill yourselves. That's not a threat. That's mathematics. Sal Gigante laughed. Actually laughed. A dry, rusty sound like a door that hadn't been opened in years. The other Italians stared at him, confused. Frank waited. You know something, Sal said. Bumpy told me about you. Years ago, said he was training a country boy who was either going to be king or get himself killed. Said you were the smartest man he'd ever met. He shook his head slowly. I should have listened. I should have killed you while Bumpy was still alive. Before you built all this, he gestured vaguely at nothing and everything. Now look at us, negotiating with a man who should be begging for his life. The world's changing, isn't it? The old ways dying. He looked at Frank with something that might have been respect. Harlem is yours. We stay out. You stay out of our business. That's the deal. Frank nodded. That's the deal. And the tribute? There is no tribute. I don't pay. You don't pay. We're equals. Separate, but equal. Isn't that how you people like it? The words carried weight. History. Irony, Carmine, and Tony looked like they wanted to argue, but Sal was done. He stood slowly, an old man accepting a new reality. We have an agreement, Mr. Lucas. I hope you understand what you've started here. The other families won't be as pragmatic. You've made yourself a target, not just from us, from everyone who sees what you've done and wonders what it means for their business. Frank stood as well. I understand perfectly, and I'm ready for all of it. He turned, walked toward the door. 8 armed men watched him go. Not one moved, because they'd seen something change at that back table. A new power had announced itself. A new player had refused to play by the old rules. And somehow, impossibly, he was walking out alive. Frank reached the door, stopped, turned back one last time. One more thing, all eyes on him. Blue magic will keep getting better. My prices will stay low. My territory will stay Harlem. But if I hear about any of your people trying to move product in my neighborhood, if I hear about any retaliation against my family or my operation, that notebook goes to every newspaper in New York. Not as revenge. As business insurance, we clear. Sal Gigante nodded slowly. Crystal clear, Mr. Lucas. Frank walked out into the cold March night. Little Italy stretched around him, quiet and hostile, but he didn't hurry. He walked those 3 blocks back to his car with the same steady pace he'd walked in, because Frank Lucas never ran from anything. When he got behind the wheel, he allowed himself exactly 10 seconds of reaction. His hands shook slightly, just slightly. Then it stopped. He started the car and drove home to Teaneck. The word spread through the streets before sunrise, through the shooting galleries, through the after-hours clubs, through the barber shops and corner stores and project stairwells where information was the only currency that never lost value. Frank Lucas had walked into a room full of Italians and walked out without paying tribute. Frank Lucas had told the Genovese family to stay out of Harlem. Frank Lucas had said 6 words that nobody had ever said and lived to repeat. I don't pay no tax to nobody. The story grew with each telling. By the time it reached 116th Street, Frank had faced down 10 men, not 3. By the time it reached the Bronx, he'd had a gun in his hand the whole time. By the time it reached Brooklyn, he'd threatened to kill Sal Gigante's children. None of it was true. The truth was more powerful. A quiet man with a notebook. A country boy who understood leverage better than men who'd been leveraging since before he was born. A businessman who'd turned protection into a shield and information into a weapon. The next Monday, Frank's phone rang in Teaneck. It was a wholesaler in the Bronx, Italian mid-level guy who'd been buying from the families for 20 years. He wanted to talk about blue magic. Maybe make a purchase. Strictly business. Frank quoted him a price. The man accepted. By Wednesday, 3 more calls came. By the end of the month, Frank Lucas was selling blue magic to Italian distributors who'd been warned to stay away from him. The profit motive is stronger than ethnic loyalty. The families could threaten their people all they wanted. But when blue magic was twice as pure at half the price, mathematics won. Always did. Frank's empire grew, not through violence, through excellence, through the simple, brutal efficiency of a better product. His brothers ran the distribution. His country boys enforced the territory. His network of bought cops and politicians kept the law at bay. And every time someone asked how a black man from North Carolina had broken the Italian monopoly, the answer was the same. He walked into Umberto's and he didn't blink dot years later, after the fall, after the trials. After the deals that saw Frank become an informant and watch his empire crumble, people asked him about that night. About facing down the Italians, about the notebook, about the 6 words that changed everything. Frank would smile, that quiet smile, the one that never quite reached his eyes. Everybody thinks power comes from guns, he'd say, from soldiers, from violence. It doesn't. Power comes from leverage, from knowing things, from making yourself too expensive to kill. The Italians had guns. I had mathematics, and mathematics always wins. The sit-down at Umberto's wasn't just a negotiation, it was a revolution. A country boy from North Carolina walking into the temple of the old order and announcing that the old order was dead, not with bullets, with numbers, with preparation, with the cold, calculating intelligence of a man who understood that the loudest one in the room is the weakest one in the room. Frank Lucas never raised his voice that night. Never made a threat he couldn't back up. Never showed fear or anger or anything except patience and certainty. And when he walked out of that restaurant, he didn't just walk out with his life, he walked out with Harlem. He walked out with an empire. He walked out with the knowledge that the rules had changed forever. Not because he'd broken them, because he'd made new ones. Better ones. His ones. That's the Frank Lucas story they don't tell you. Not the violence. Not the Bodies. Not the heroin that destroyed communities. The business. The calculation. The transformation of a poor black kid from the South into a man who made the Italian mob negotiate, who turned their own tactics against them, who understood that in America, everything is business, even crime, especially crime. If this story of how Frank Lucas changed the game hit different, smash that subscribe button. We're telling the stories that American Gangster left out. The deals, the confrontations, the moments that built an empire. Drop a like if you understand why the quietest man in the room is usually the most dangerous. And in the comments, would you have walked into that restaurant alone? No bodyguards, no backup, just a notebook and mathematics. More Frank Lucas stories dropping soon. The Golden Triangle. The military coffins. The chinchilla coat that cost him everything. Don't miss any of it.